Well, thank you very much, Amitabh, and the honour is mine. It's nice to see here not just a good crowd, but people that I know and knew in India. Eric and Jeff served in the High Commission at the same time. Helen visited, and of course my wife Jan was there all of that time. Tiffin's familiar to me. Before I joined the Foreign Service, I actually lived in Kalgoorlie, and the miners there call their lunch Tiffin, and they carry Tiffin tins, which actually were made out of kerosene tins. And of course, when I went to India, we had Tiffin, and we had Tiffin boxes with the 3 layers, you know, with the rice, curry, chapati. So Tiffin's a term, I guess it comes from a common Cornish heritage. But this period, as Amitabh said, it was quite special. Obviously for Jan and me personally, it was the first time we'd ever been out of Australia, etc. And taking a 5-week-old son, we went off to India. But for India, really important. And as I've increasingly come to understand, and you know, when you're in the vortex of a storm, you don't see the whole picture. I've increasingly come to understand just how formative that period was in relation to a lot of what followed. A point worth remembering here is that I'm talking 1970 to 73. 1970 was only 23 years after independence and partition. So it's like, for people now, 1990 would be. It was as fresh as that for people then. You know, one of the joys of India was being able to talk to people who'd been around all through that period. I mean, political leaders and academics and so on who had first-hand experience and talked to about not just the petition and the ugliness of what happened, but talked about you know, the politics that had led to it, and it was quite fresh. It now seems like ancient history, but it was very fresh then. I didn't come to India entirely fresh, I've got to say, in this sense that there's the word Campbell in my name, Richard Campbell, that rests lazily between the given and surnames, and family legend has it derives from Sir Colin Campbell, of ill repute in Lucknow, but better regarded in Peshawar, where he laid out the new streets. So there is that connection. And then when I met Jan at university, she was studying Indian history with Peter Reeves. And so Basham's great tome became part of her dowry. When we married, is known as the wonder that was Basham, like around the world. And then when we were married, and this dowry was duly delivered, it was by an Indian priest, an Anglican minister, Cyril Manuel, who had come to Australia from St Paul's in Darjeeling, and was very keen for us to go to Darjeeling and teach for a time, and we would have had I not joined the Foreign Service. So there was something serendipitous about going to India, and you know, nothing plotted. The Department of External Affairs then was not able to plot anything any better than it can now, but the marbles rolled and the barrel rolled, the marbles fell, and they fell our way. The High Commission then, the High Commissioner was Sir Patrick Shaw. He'd newly arrived, presented credentials the week before, and he was one of a long line of distinguished people there, but I remember going with him on about the second day there to Rajghat as part of his credentials ceremony to watch the flames there. I remember having to go out and arrange appointments with him on about day 2 with people like Chakravarti Rajagopalachari and so on. Pat was unforgiving about the pronunciation of names, and on day 1 you had to have it right, or you were sent back, and it's a great lesson for a young officer. The High Commission access in town at standing seemed to me terrific, wonderful. We saw, of course, the politicians easily, wonderfully accessible members of Parliament and of state assemblies, journalists, fantastic community of journalists, G.K. Reddy and Sudarshan Bhatia and Nihal Singh and C.S. Pandit and so on. Great academics and students. Subramaniam was a big figure even then. I last saw him in 2005 before he died. Around the states, very easy to travel. You know, legendary names, Jyoti Basu and EMS Namboodirapad and Devraj Urs, these guys, you could go and see them as a third secretary, you could go and see them. Wonderful hours spent with Khushwant Singh and Neeraj Chowdhury. I spoke to him for an hour and a half. He made 2 really important points, but I didn't understand either. But yeah, these are sort of collector's items. I had Autobiography of an Unknown Indian, and like all Australians in India, I had my books bound in leather. You know, it was a paperback, but you feel a book done in leather. And normally they were Great Expectations, Charles Dickens, and they wrote Autobiography Unknown. But all of that was very live and a very formative period for us. In terms of Indian politics, I guess what's really important is that Mrs. Gandhi had just split the Congress, or they split from her, and the old syndicate crowd of Kamaraj and Moraji Bhai and so on, and they remained the Congress, and she was Congress I, and she was governing in a minority government and under a great deal of pressure. Really, looking back, I guess there were two big questions in Indian politics amid the excitement of whether a minority government could survive. The first was India going communist? Communist parties were being elected everywhere, in West Bengal and Kerala, and she was ruling dependent upon them. A book had been published called Kerala, Sichuan of China, which had got the external commentariat running. For us, that wasn't a big issue at all. We could see that the communist parties were just vote seekers like the rest of them, and Communist Party leaders I knew lived in capacious apartments and high rises in Bombay and so on. But there were some implications for it, particularly in regard to the way the United States came to see India, and of course in the way that that impeded the development of rational economic policy in India at that time. The second big issue was centrifugal forces. Now, I raise this because you don't hear of it anymore, but in the 60s and 70s it was quite popular to speculate about the prospect of centrifugal forces spinning off for the states, going separate and so on. And of course what happened in East Pakistan fed into that a bit in the end. Again, we never thought that was going to happen, but it was something the commentariat had its teeth into all through. Eventually, of course, Mrs. Gandhi regained some ground in the 71 midterm elections, and then had an extraordinary victory in the 72 elections based on not just the war with Pakistan, but the whole Garibi Hataao campaign, and rose to dominance in Indian politics. I left in 73, nothing to do with me, got to climb after that. But, there was the drought setting in 72, 73, very bad, and then the oil price hikes greatly affected India, some political scandals, all of which led her into the declaration of state of emergency, and then eventually to the election in 77, which she lost. But 70 to 73, she showed a lot of courage and determination and worked really hard at holding together that sort of coalition, that minority government, amidst enormous pressure on the East Pakistan issue. And it was very skillful and gutsy politics that you could only admire. Pakistan under war, well, this is worth talking about. And there's a few points to make. We're looking now at Syria, and we're wringing our hands and we're desperate, and millions of people are being moved about, and they're in refugee camps, and 100,000 have died. You've got to remember, it was as nothing compared with what happened in East Pakistan. Something between 10 and 12 million people left East Pakistan to come into the states of India, and India much less well placed to cope with them than even Jordan or Lebanon now. And there were horrendous atrocities happening. I don't think there's an agreed figure now on how many people the East Pakistani army killed, but it's something between 100,000 and 300,000. An enormous number, and the stories were extraordinary. I had an experience myself. I went to Agartala in Tripura. We were providing food aid and medicine and covers for plastic tarpaulins and so on. And there were more refugees, displaced people, refugees, let's call them, living in Tripura than residents of Tripura. And they were in the streets in Agartala. You had to park a car and walk through the streets because people had built huts out of, they split the 3-ply tea boxes and made igloos out of them, and cardboard, and of course there was no running water, there was no sewerage, it was just a horrendous hospital, it was a nightmare. And I took a taxi down to the border and looked over, and running on the border was at the foot of a hill, and I was on the hill, and running through the paddy fields came a family, a man carrying a child, it might have been about 3, and another little boy running beside him, limping, and the mother trying to push them along. And they crossed over the border past this stone post where there's a few Indian people waiting for them. And the boy who was being carried by his father had a piece of shrapnel in his head. And the one who was running had a piece in his stomach. The Pakistan army was putting airburst mortar out. You know, the mortar explodes above the rice field and the shrapnel spreads. So I took the dad and the 2 little kids and the mum into the taxi, and we raced into town to the hospital. There was only space for them along the floor here, but at least they removed the shrapnel and they gave it to me. I have it now. And sort of cleaned it up, and then they left them, and there's nothing more that I could do. I left some money, and what do you do? But it was very real, and forgotten, you see. And this is one of the problems, that for all of the horror of this thing, it was not attracting international opprobrium or attention on the scale of the issue. Partly because of where India sat in the world, partly because the reluctance of the United States to say and do what it might have been doing in years later. I don't know why, a lot of reasons, but anyway, there was considerable disillusionment in India about that. Because the international community of which India had been such an active and constructive participant through the UN all these years, had really let them down as they saw it, and B, because even the non-aligned movement wouldn't speak up, because Pakistan was the other side, and there was a strong Muslim content. Countries like Egypt, from which India had expected greater support, were silent on this. So a matter of great frustration for India and Indians, and I think reflects in later positions that they took. The second element that is important here is the one that Amitabh alluded to, and that is the US-India equation. And I take this back, of course you can go back many years on that relationship, but let's start at 1962. India had thought, when the China War broke out, that there would be at least political support from the United States, and there was none. And they later learned that this had been discussed between the Chinese and American ambassadors in Warsaw. The Chinese ambassador in Warsaw had spoken to the American ambassador in 1962, in about September, and said, in the event of a conflict between China and India, where would you stand? The question went to Washington. The answer came back, nowhere, your business. India learned of that sometime later. Important. Then, of course, Mrs. Gandhi became dependent on the Communist Party, and the relationship with the Soviet Union grew. Nixon, paranoid about this, developed a deep dislike for Mrs. Gandhi and all that he saw that she stood for, and that set the scene for 71. And then, as you said, the breakthrough with China, in which not only the US had a strong relationship with Pakistan, supplying arms and so on, but Kissinger used the cover of his visit to Pakistan to go to China, and that seemed to suggest a pretty close relationship there. And it was in response to that, within a month, that India and the Soviet Union concluded that treaty. It had been under discussion for a couple of years. But my view is that firstly it was greatly hastened to a conclusion, and secondly that additional paragraphs were written into it to reflect that the security development. It wasn't a mutual defence pact, as you said, but it was a very important signal all around. And there's no question that the Soviet Union was exploiting a moment when India was vulnerable to this approach, but equally, as India saw it, with the prospect of war with Pakistan looking unavoidable now, and with the US, Pakistan and China aligned, India needed cover from the Soviet Union. And the Indian view then and remains that worked. That without that cover, China might well have intervened. Our old friend of this institute, Shyam Saran, has recently written on that subject. That's his view. It mattered. Now, what we now know, and I didn't know then sitting there in New Delhi, is that the Americans, I think Kissinger, at Nixon's direction, actually spoke to the Chinese ahead of that war in about November of 71 and asked, if, in the event of a conflict, will you take some action on the border with India to get the pressure off Pakistan? And the Chinese, to their great credit, said no. But that was the play, and I don't know how much of that the Indian government knew, but they could well have figured that something that was possible. And as they saw it, the Soviet treaty was the counter to that, and it probably was. Of course, that wasn't the end of it. The Americans, absent any Chinese action, they then, toward the end of the war, you recall, moved a battle group, not just any battle group, but the Enterprise battle group into the Bay of Bengal. I remember it coming. We're sitting there in India, the war was on, what the heck? The Enterprise, what's that got to do with it, and us? It was a bizarre moment in which everybody was puzzled and stunned, and frankly, it's barely explicable now. India had done all it could, incidentally through the Australian government too, to say to the Americans that our intent in the event of this war is limited. It is limited to East Pakistan. We are not concerned about West Pakistan. There is no territorial intent. We are not going to use this to settle Kashmir once and for all. It will be confined to East Pakistan. But the Americans didn't believe this clearly. And it's a bad moment in history because they got it so badly wrong. And the implications are lasting. India was not, in my view, ever very comfortable in its cultural sense with the Soviet treaty. But it clearly could see that it was being outplayed on the chessboard. So what's the counter to that? It has developed a nuclear capability, their own nuclear capability. Leads me to a thought I'll expand on later about India's Gaullism. But that was the alternative to dependence on the Soviet Union, given the way the chessboard had been realigned, I think. Anyway, it was momentous, and so incidentally, when the United States came knocking after the end of the Cold War and with the rise of China and said, what about it? Isn't it time we got back into bed? And India said, we don't trust you. This chessboard moves around too much and too much in your interests for us to do that. And I think the impact's lasting. I remember the day the Soviet treaty was signed, it was All India Day, 9th of August, and we were out at lunch somewhere and suddenly this news came through and people went mad, and great speculation about it. And our High Commissioner Patrick Shaw wrote a very interesting dispatch, as they call him, Minister I have the honour to present, blah, 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 which Meg Gurry is liberated from the archives and is around, and it's worth reading, and most of the calls he made were pretty good. Which leads me to the next point, and that is this, that throughout that emerging tension and into the conflict and the birth of Bangladesh, the position the Australian government took was very much our own. It differed very much. We're at poles with the United States on the issue, and it differed from UK and Western Europe as well. We were firstly very sympathetic to India because of the refugee outflow and that problem. We gave a lot of aid and we were very active in doing it. We secondly tried to beat the drum internationally, but with some success, but not as much as we'd have liked. And thirdly, we positioned ourselves very quickly to recognise the new government of Bangladesh, and I think after India we were the first country to do so. It was a very independent position, different from the United States, and we were at odds with the US on this matter. We were right at the time, and history shows us to have been right. The argument was along the lines that, Bangladesh, East Pakistan, it's going to be a complete shambles. It'll never be able to govern itself. We can't allow the emergence of an unworkable state. Well, Pakistan, it couldn't have been worse. And the Pakistan leadership of Yahya Khan, who incidentally I now read, Nixon regarded Yahya Khan as a sort of Abe Lincoln equivalent. This drunken general standing tall as a Lincoln-like figure in the midst of a civil war. This was Nixon's perception of the man. You see, it's a tragic thing, this. Anyway, I think that we did the right thing. We've indicated that, and in the years since, Bangladesh has been at least as well run as Pakistan, and that's to its credit. The war itself, of course, began on the 3rd of December. It was over by the 21st. We had the paper over the windows in our house because the vigilantes didn't want to see the lights. The Pakistani M5s might have worked out where Delhi was by seeing a chink of light out of the High Commission. And it was not only us, incidentally. A great photograph, if you can ever find it, is of a huge camouflage net which they lowered over the Taj Mahal because it was moonlight and you wouldn't want to see it, as though the Pakistan Air Force didn't know where Agra was. But it was just a dramatic time. We had buckets of water in every room in the house. It was sort of World War II thinking we brought to this thing. Everybody was confident that India would win the war. Not everybody. There was a view that says, Pakistan's superior. This is the Muslim martial race, all that stuff. And they've got these wonderful tanks, and there's going to be a blitzkrieg across the Sindh into Delhi. They hardly got out of their hangars before they were flattened. And this marvellous tactical call that the Indian Armed Forces made by arming patrol boats with missiles, completely unexpectedly, racing them out of Bombay and taking out the oil refineries and the airport in Karachi. I had to arrange for them to stop shelling the airport in Karachi. I did this as the Third Secretary, exchanging notes with MEA, because there were 150 Australians and New Zealanders to be evacuated. We positioned a Qantas plane in Colombo and we wanted them to stop shelling while the plane got in and got out. And unbelievably they did it. I was given the job by the High Commissioner, presumably because they thought it wouldn't work. And notes were exchanged, and someone in MEA took it to the military headquarters and they said, you've got a window from 11 to 11:30 on whatever this day was, and it stopped. Qantas couldn't believe it. Anyway, they went in and these people came out. But it was a remarkable bit of Indian bureaucracy. It really worked. But there were dramatic times, and when the Enterprise battle group went into the Bay of Bengal, they said, we are sitting here in this regional war preoccupied by this, and suddenly it's gone global. What the hell is this about? And from our lounge rooms and offices in Delhi, we could not readily understand it. Dramatic times. India showed great patience through that. Mrs. Gandhi managed a difficult situation. There were people, of course, who were wanting to go to war earlier, saying, 12 million people, how much of this can we cop? Atrocities against our kinfolk. Why doesn't India intervene and put a stop to this? Janasangh was pressing hard. Reservations existed only because most of them were Muslims who were coming across the border, which was another reason for driving them back. So there was complications of that sectarian kind in all of this, and she was managing huge pressure through it all and doing it adroitly. PM Dar, fellow Kashmiri, later wrote that the approach was probably guided by Napoleon's famous dictum, never interrupt an enemy when he's making a mistake. Nice. And so Pakistan was allowed to dig its hole, and there it was. Just a bit of colour in this. I said that we had tremendous access, travelled a lot in India. Did indeed. I think I went to every state except Orissa. Every state that then existed, there are more now, except Orissa. Big cyclones even when I was there. I remember that. I don't know why I didn't get to Orissa, but it was tremendously interesting to travel around. I referred before to footage of the camouflage over the Taj Mahal. I don't know what's become of a wonderful movie, a documentary called Calcutta 71. It was made not by Satyajit Ray, but by whom?
I can't remember. I know what you mean.
Yeah, it's a wonderful, and it evokes so evocative. It was just.
It's probably Mrinal's Sen.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. If the Institute ever gets hold of this, I'd love to see it. It's a marvellous documentary, and so evocative of that time, Calcutta 71. So, visited there at that time. Got tossed out of Assam. That was a very short visit of a few hours. I got off the plane at Guwahati when they hadn't expected me to, and took a taxi up to the capital. And I was in the hotel only for a couple of hours, and the special branch arrived and said I didn't have the right permit and chucked me out. That kind of paranoia came to pervade India a lot about Westerners during this period. I went travelling through Madhya Pradesh in the 1972 election. The High Commissioner gave me a car and a driver, and I just rambled around, talked to people. Very interesting, learned a lot about how way democracy worked and all that. But they started to follow me there, and then a report appeared in the New Delhi press, not just the Patriot, but in the serious papers as well, that said there was a CIA agent roaming around Madhya Pradesh. And the American embassy was furious about this because of the paranoia, they had deliberately not gone out, and they sat in their bunkers hoping to avoid any attention in the election. They were completely inactive. And I was out there, and the CIA got the blame. It was win-win, really. And a wonderful time. I went to Sikkim and called on the Chogyal and the Gyalmo Cook, the Muse of New York. The Indian resident didn't know what we were doing there. I don't think we did either. It was sort of collector's item time. Called on the Kamapapa Lama, who lived in a treehouse, the yellow hat Lama. Crawled up into the bottom of the treehouse and across the floor and had the mare's milk. And some years later in Tibet, I asked if I could call on him again because he's back there. I said, "Oh no, this is only a 16-year-old boy." I said, "No, it's the same bloke. It's just a reincarnation. Sure, you remember me." No, he's much too immature to meet with ambassadors. And then I must say I didn't read accurately the. What was going to happen in Sikkim. I was aware of the community tension between the people from Tibet and people from other areas, and I didn't realise quite how unstable it all was, and indeed it was only a year later, I suppose, that the takeover took place. Didn't get it right all the time either in other places. In Goa, I went down to Goa on a consular case. A lot of Australian kids who were travelling around then, as there's now, but less maturely. And they, a lot of them got to Goa, and they liked to smoke something there that made them see the world differently. And this poor devil, he'd been smoking a bit, and he set fire to a haystack and climbed up a tree and jumped into it thinking he would rise as a phoenix. And sadly, he was not right. And so we had to gather up his ashes and return him to Australia. A couple of interesting days in Goa, from which I drew this conclusion later. 1974 had nothing to do with Australian policy in relation to East Timor, but I did find myself saying, look, India took over Goa in 61 too.
61.
Yep, and it worked. I was there 9 years later and nobody cared. They were happy to be part of India. There was no tension. It was all functioning, and India and Goa were better off for it, and probably so was Portugal. When it happened in 74, I thought, well, surely this will happen here. The wisdom of subfusing it into the natural partner, Indonesia, has got to be self-evident. Why, anyway, would you set up another mendicant state in this region? I was wrong. For two reasons, I suspect. One is India just ran Goa a heck of a lot better than Indonesia ever ran East Timor. Much more benignly and cleverly and so on. And secondly, I think Timorese are different from Goans, and there were many more of them. But anyway, I drew the wrong lesson there. And I think in retrospect, we drew some wrong lessons about the India-Pakistan war. After that war, we said two things. Okay, that's it. Pakistan can now give up its subcontinental aspirations and should turn westwards and find its natural home in West Asia with all those Muslim people. Well, they did, and look where that led to. That was a bad call, locking back into India. Not that they were taking our advice, it was going to happen anyway. And the second call was to think, this whole balanced tit-for-tat game that we had to play between India and Pakistan should now be over. But it never did end, it doesn't even now. And the Pakistanis have been extremely astute at keeping that alive, and India is too reactive to it, and so the game goes on, 40 years later. Travelled around India a lot privately as well, went to game parks, loved all of that, took the kids everywhere. Played a lot of cricket, And tennis at Rashtrapati Bhavan, we had some friends and used to invited up there to play tennis. Met Mrs. Gandhi's son, an airline pilot, a new Italian wife, working out how to wear a sari and doing it well. A little boy named Rahul, who was the same age as our son. Played tennis with them up there, lovely. Didn't see Sanjay, he was in a much faster set. But Rajiv was there. The next time I went doing he was 1975, and then the very next time was 1991, and by that time all the Gandhis had died. A little poignancy that I was thinking about as I prepared for this, but it's a tragedy it was. Yeah, I went to the next. I had some work to do with India in the 1990s. As I said, I was there. In fact, the day that Iraq invaded Kuwait, and the perspective on that was interesting. We had a little crisis in relation to the sale of the MiG aircraft, Mirage aircraft to Pakistan, which I think we fortunately blocked in the end. But there was nothing big for me until I became engaged in the Afghan issue. And what happened was that in 2009, the Obama administration decided to create this network of special representatives or envoys for Afghanistan and Pakistan. Richard Holbrooke in the US was at the forefront of that. The dozen or 15 states that had a bigger role in Afghanistan at first formed this group. It later expanded to 50. But the whole purpose of this, frankly, was to write the foreign ministries back into the Afghan script. The defence ministries of the world, from the Pentagon onwards, had dominated Afghanistan policy. There was never going to be a military outcome. There had to be a way through this. Who does compromise? Foreign ministries do that. Let's put together this bunch of special envoys to try to work this through. Now, Holbrooke was called Special Envoy for Afghanistan and Pakistan. The original proposition had been that he should be called Special Envoy for India as well. Anyone who knows India would know that would never be acceptable. Special envoys are for basket cases. We're not one of them. We don't want to be in that basket. Anyway, sense prevailed, but India had to be in this network. India would not, however, designate a special representative, because in diplomatic terms it might be seen to be condescending in any way, it would have been too close. They never, however, missed a meeting. So there'd be everybody's title and name at the table, and there was Sadi Lamba, S.K. Lamba, sitting there without a title, but at the table participating, never listed in the attendees, and he was a great participant. Do you know him? Peshawar-born Hindu, crossed to India at petition, took a very dark view of Pathans, as he called Pashtuns, and played a very important role in keeping us grounded on what might be possible on Afghanistan. And it was great company too. He's done an interesting paper on the Durand line, which he sent to me some time ago, and the history of it. Anyway, he was there at all the meetings and a valued member of it. 2010, when the process of transition, drawdown, etc., was resolved, I went to India, as I did to Iran and other places, to talk about how India saw this. Because for India, the NATO ISAF presence there was Plan A. That was the cork in the bottle. Now the cork was going to come out of the bottle. How would India handle the uncertainty that lay ahead? The answer was simple. There is no Plan B. There cannot be. We just have to make sure we're big enough and tough enough to handle whatever happens. And that's been our history since 1947. And that, I think, basically underpins it. The interesting thing, though, was the first call I had was on M.K. Narayanan, then the National Security Advisor, and it was a good meeting. But he began by saying, "Oh, you've come from Pakistan?" "Yes. And I suppose you saw your friends in ISI?" I said, "Some." He said, "Because you know that's Australia's creation." Yes. See, ISI was created by Major General Walter Cawthorne, an Australian general in the British Army in India at the time of partition, who was directed by the British Army to go to the Pakistan side and help them set up their army. He became Deputy Chief of Staff, and he created ISI. He retired in due course, came back to Australia, Cawthorne, and the Menzies government appointed him as High Commissioner to Pakistan. And Nehru took this badly and asked his foreign minister to, as Nehru put it, gently nudge the Australian High Commissioner, saying that the appointment of Cawthorne was inappropriate because he was not neutral, and that in the negotiations over Pakistan, Kashmir in 47-48, he had been the toughest of the Pakistanis. Anyway, the appointment went ahead and there it lay. But it's an interesting little bit of history which Eric is nodding about. You've seen those exchanges, yeah. The relationship with Australia. Well, you know, I said we had great access, we had tremendous friends, no subject was off the agenda except the Soviet Union. We were always on the opposite sides of a divide. I mean, we were very much part of the US alliance, as of course was Pakistan then. We were engaged in Vietnam. There was a good discussion to be had about Vietnam because India was on the International Control Commission for Indochina, so they had a perspective. But so we could have a dialogue about it, but we were poles apart in where it was all going. And fundamentally, it was the Cold War period, and we were on one side of the divide. India was in the middle or toward the other side, and you know it just didn't work at that level. Trade and investment prospects were zilch. India was still in the sort of Nehruvian socialist import substitution, autarkic planning commission 5-year plan mode. The economy was clearly not going anywhere, and they were certainly not interested in imports and not doing much by way of exports. Visa issues were always there. It was a time of white Australia and the legend was strong. It was, you know, we were comfortable with the people, but the quality of discussion was never all that it might have been. One thing worth drawing attention to, we had a very big aid program, big aid project up at Hisar. It was a sheep grazing project, modern irrigation and so on. And it was a huge, for us it was a jewel in the crown. Indians were sceptical. Maybe they didn't like aid as a matter of principle. Maybe they felt that this is the very least that rich Australia ought to be doing. We don't have to show much gratitude to this, whatever. Anyway, and maybe they thought we didn't have anything to teach them about agriculture. Maybe they were right with that. At all events, it was a huge preoccupation for the High Commission. Bureaucratic work, imports, visas, God, there was stuff going on all the time. Huge. For very little return. Today, there is not a trace of that project. There's not a footprint in the dust. There's not a fence post. We put millions into it. Contributed, it's one of a number of experiences over 50 years that's led me to scepticism about aid, and particularly aid of that kind. Of course, in this Cold War era, and Menzies was known not to get on with Nehru, and that flowed through a bit, there's a tendency to think Australians were not very friendly to India, but the contrary is so as you go through our archives. I mean, Casey was a great friend of India, his foreign minister, and he seeded a lot of friendship through the Australian bureaucracy for India. And I'll tell you a couple of stories. When Sir James Plimsoll was appointed as High Commissioner to India at the end of '62, it was a very deliberate choice and quickly made, and Plimsoll was moved quickly from New York to Delhi. Because India had taken a beating in the China War and was feeling decidedly friendless and becoming inward-looking, and someone in wisdom in Australia said, let's get there someone who has real standing, can listen to people sympathetically, and hopefully talk to them, keep the lights on. And Plimsoll was the ideal man for that, and did very well. And it was one of the players later when Mrs. Gandhi wanted to talk to us about other things. It was a really well-meant thing. I'll tell you another example. One of the first jobs I had to do in the High Commission, I probably had to report to Jeff Bentley on it. I had to collect weather reports. Every month I got a report from the Indian Bureau of Meteorology, and it came on sort of brown paper, and it was all hard to read because Stepner was crook and all that stuff, and I'd get covered in ink trying to work it out. But I had to condense this weather report into a letter to Sir John Crawford, one of the great emeritus figures of Australian bureaucratic history. Crawford was a great friend of C. Subramanian, the outstanding agriculture minister of the time. And India, of course, had been through a period of really bad crops. It was importing food, desperate times. And, of course, not only was there significant social and economic impact of that, potentially political. And so we had a way of calibrating food aid to weather reports. Famine here, doing well there, moving around. And Crawford gave this personal attention, these letters. So a number of examples of that kind of real personal engagement with India. So what comes out of all of this rambling? I think firstly for me and for Jan and our family, fantastically formative time. Personally, I developed a lot of friends in India, and some of those were people who became in good standing in their own governments. Vijay Nambiar and Shyam Saran, whom I met overseas years later and worked closely with, and they were wonderful colleagues. When I was ambassador in China, Vijay Nambiar was one of the go-to people, and Shyam Saran's understanding of China is fantastic. If you haven't read his K. Subramanian lecture of 2 years ago, it's an outstanding analysis of China and how you work with China, making the essential point that the better India's relationship with the US, the easier it will be to work with China. It's a very shrewd strategic judgment, a great piece of reading for you at some time. So learned a lot personally and professionally in a very professional High Commission, reporting to people like Jeff and getting my knuckles wrapped and mispronouncing names and so on. I've got to say this, if I may, I'm still comfortable with India. I mean, 12 years after I left China and after returning a number of times, I'm very cautious about judgments about China. I'm not sure. I think I understand where it is today, but I can't see all of what lies ahead. I don't have that feeling about India. I hope I'm not sounding arrogant in that. I've always been able to pick up a paper and read India and say, yeah, that's familiar. I understand what's going on there. And maybe it's just a personal reflection of that great Coral Bell conclusion. You know, Coral has said the difference between India and China is this, that India's destiny is settled, China's is not. And maybe that's partly what shapes that kind of uncertainty too. History, fascinated by it, always talk to people. You know, I've got this madcap theory that I've explained to you before, that partition was not only a mistake and a tragedy, but it was a bluff that was called. That Jinnah and Liaquat Ali could, you know, trying to negotiate a power-sharing deal with the Congress, put the bluff on the table. Nehru might have responded to it, but the hard men, Vallabhbhai Patel and Kamaraj and so on, wouldn't have a bar of it and pushed it through the petition. I don't know if that's right, but I began to get that sense when I was in India and have thought about it more since. Others will know better. Culture, well, we used to talk about contradictions in India, and now the serious students of India don't like you doing that, but you really, as an outsider, can't get away from it. Obviously, poverty, but the extreme and obscene wealth at the other end. Of course, that always challenges people, as it challenges Indians like ourselves. A marvellous middle class developed in India and is shaping world affairs in lots of ways, but it's packed around by a feudal top end and a feudal bottom end still. You wrestle with that. I know Indian friends who do. The great Hindu eclecticism, openness, the non-violent tradition, juxtaposed with the extraordinary violence of India. These things always challenge outsiders. I hope I'm not offending Indian friends here in saying this, but they do. The resentment of the United Kingdom, understandable and deserved in so many ways, but at the same time the obsessiveness with things British, from cricket to manners to rule of law to parliaments to Fair Isle sweaters to the patronising of hapless Australians. All of that is there. Those contradictions, we can talk about, and academics will knock me around, but personally those things are still much in my mind. Strategy, I like this idea of India. We've moved beyond non-alignment and away in a genuine strategic terms, as opposed to foreign policy posturing. India moved beyond non-alignment before the end of the Cold War. But I do believe that India has a good strategic sense of itself, and it is founded in what I call Gaullism. You know, Australia, to put it another way, Australia is in a faithful relationship with the United States. We flirt a bit elsewhere, but we never finish up in anybody else's bedroom. India will be, I'm not using the term in a loaded way, promiscuous. It will work out its relationships according to the issue of the time, but always ensuring that it has an independent capability for making big decisions about itself, and that is founded now in its nuclear capability. Regrettably, of course, that spun off into Pakistan's nuclear capability and all sorts of things followed, but I do think it's very much like the position that France tried to place itself in the 1950s, independent strategic view of itself. And as to the future, finally, it's hard not to be profoundly concerned about Pakistan and the way in which what could unfold there and the difficulties it faces. Its population grows and grows to 300 million, all under 80% of them below the age of 40 or something or other by whatever date it is, the whole scenario. You've got to worry about all that and their inability to manage the fundamentalist and other challenges they face. And that will be a burden for the whole subcontinent and for India in particular. Sadly, I think India does allow itself to be too preoccupied by that, but understandably in so many ways it is. The only way I see through it, and I dare offer this prognostication as a retired old fart with no influence in these things anymore, but is through economic integration of the region. The model is East Asia. Think of the sovereignty, border, political disputes that determined the shape of East Asia in 1975, post-Vietnam, Korea, Taiwan, all that stuff still going on in Indochina, and so on. It looked pretty fraught. But what happened was that from about 1980, early 80s onwards, the region committed itself to economic decision-making, subjugating all other forms of decisions. They developed open economies for the most part, and their economies are now thoroughly integrated. South Korean trade with China at the end of the 80s was virtually zero. By the mid-90s, it was $20 billion a year. Who knows what it is now? All of that stuff was prioritised, privileged over decision-making related to issues of security and borders and disputes. And that's reshaped the region completely. We're not out of the woods on those security risks in East Asia, but making decisions in favour of resolving them, which would risk the economy, is a big call for any government in the region now to make. It would be good to get to that position in the subcontinent, firstly for the sake of the security of that region, but secondly for Pakistan's sake. The only way through Pakistan's huge economic and therefore social dilemma, as I see it, is for it to become part of a great South Asian economy. Open borders. Sure, some industries in Pakistan would collapse, but others would replace industries in India, that whole picture. And only thus will it generate an economy and employment of a kind which Pakistan is going to need in order to survive, and only thus, I think, can India liberate itself from that millstone and aspire to the kind of place in the world that we'd like to see.
Thank you.